We all know that there are three official roles in Overwatch: tank, DPS, and support. And many of us know that there are a couple meta-defined subcategories, including, but not limited to, main support and off-tank. But since these roles have been defined, OW2 has grown and changed a lot, and balancing around these larger roles has become increasingly more difficult. So that's why I want to propose my own solutions to this problem. Some are inspired by things I've heard floating around the community, and some are my own somewhat radical ideas. So, basically, let's start with what I find to be the biggest problems, right? Let's define what are the issues with how roles are kind of implemented in the game right now. So, basically, these categories, in my opinion, are too big and have too much variety in playstyles and design within those roles, right? It's really hard to balance an entire role around such a different, like, just there's such a variety of types of playstyles and everything. You know, there's like, I don't even know how many DPS characters, like 18 or something, and they're all supposed to do the exact same thing. You know, I feel like we've been seeing this with tanks. I think there's, 12 tanks right now? And there are definitely tanks that do their jobs differently. And in fact, I think there are some tanks that just straight up do different jobs than the other tanks. Now, let's also talk, like, this is not a debate about 5v5, but it can be a lot of pressure on a solo tank to navigate counters alone, right? It's not impossible. There are plenty of tanks that have lots of good counterplay, but it is much harder than it has been in the past, right? And also, another problem, role passives benefit some characters more than others, and I feel like there have been some unintended consequences with the role passives. When you have to give a passive to an entire group of characters, there are going to be some characters that don't really benefit and don't really need role passives, like Sigma, in my opinion. And then he just has, like, okay, and he also takes less damage. Why does Sigma need to take less damage? He also gets knocked back more. Why does Sigma need to get knocked back more? It just makes him better and better when he really didn't need to have any help in the first place. You know what I mean? So basically, those are a couple of problems with the game, right? And I think that it kind of stems down to, so I think role lock is kind of where a lot of these problems are still causing problems. Now, let me be clear. Role lock was a net positive, and it made the game playable outside of competitive. When you just hop on the ladder, role lock is absolutely necessary. We need role lock. But it did force certain characters to be balanced in certain ways that just don't really make sense for them. You know, like Roadhog has to be a tank and do certain tank things that he just really can't do. So he has to just be given other stuff to, like, stitch himself into the role. In fact, I'm going to talk about Roadhog in a second. Think about Sombra and Roadhog, right? Who, before role lock, 2018, all of that good stuff, they weren't great in their respective given roles. Like, why would you play Roadhog as a tank, and why would you play Sombra for damage, right? They weren't really great back then, but they found some success in early metas as kind of like faux supports, right? They were categorized as DPS or tank, but were utilized in completely different ways, right? Basically, you know, they weren't shoehorned into the arbitrary roles because you could pick anything at any time, right? So they could be placed in different categories, right? I think Zarya is another example. That could just be a DPS character, right? She could have been utilized back then as, you know, like another DPS if you wanted more tankiness, more survivability, and more synergy with other characters. You could play Zarya in that DPS role and not necessarily the tank role, right? Let me see. Nowadays, though, and I'm going to talk about tank just because, you know, it's the role that is the hot topic right now. But, you know, every role, this goes for every role, but let's talk about tanks, right? Every tank needs to be able to do the same type of job, right? Which, with that wide variety of characters, right? Like, Reinhardt takes space and pulls aggro much different than Wrecking Ball does, much different than Roadhog does. In fact, Roadhog doesn't really take space or aggro at all in, you know, the same sense. No, Roman, this is my old gameplay. I just found something to put on in the background. Um, and that's kind of like what I want to recapture a little bit, but also like reminder, this is not roll queue, right? This is not like no roll queue. This is not going back to old Overwatch. This is not just hitting the reset button. This is kind of like an entirely new solution that works with what we're trying to get at with Overwatch 2, with you know what they've been doing, but also kind of put us back in a spot where we bring back some of the playmaking, the decision making on comps, and the synergies with other characters. So I'm gonna put this away for now. Let's talk about my big radical idea. Okay, I want to tighten our scope of focus for roles. Actually, you can't see this. Hold on, give me 1 second. Now, don't freak out. I'm going to explain this in just a second. But let's heighten our focus on roles, okay? I propose a system where every person in the lobby, every individual person is going to be playing a unique, defined role. Similar to how a MOBA would work, right? Think of League of Legends. League has top lane, jungler, bottom, support, and mid lane, I think. I think that's all of them. That is kind of what Overwatch is going to have. Instead of just having tanks, 1 tank, 2 DPS, 2 supports, they're going to have... I've given them kind of arbitrary names, but, you know, they're kind of... Don't worry about the names too much. We'll have tanks, enforcers, DPS, protectors, and heroes, right? So you can only... You know, basically everybody's going to have a unique role, and that they're going to be trying to do a certain thing on the battlefield, right? This would limit the pool of characters for each role, and it also gives the individual roles a more defined idea of how they should be aiming for, okay? Basically, what this kind of does is that if we limit the pool and create new roles and limit how many characters are in each role, we can much better define what each individual role is going to do, right? It's hard to say, like, what is one support going to do? And it's much easier to say, like, what does a protector do compared to a hero, right? Again, is just hold on with the names. I know they're just kind of arbitrary right now. Basically, you know, characters that are playable in each spot are also different from traditional roles that we know, right? So it's not just like tank, support, DPS. These are all a mixture, you know, like kind of like a smorgasbord of them. So before I go into the two different things, like I just want to make it clear what it is here, right? So characters are going to be defined by these smaller categories, and they can only be picked in these smaller categories, right? The idea of tank, DPS, and support is basically not here anymore, right? We're not going to define them like that. We're going to define them as these 5 different roles, okay? And again, I'm about to get to the spreadsheet, but it's important to assume a different change while we're talking about this, where only one of each role is allowed in a match, right? There's only going to be 1 tank, 1 enforcer, so on and so forth. But you don't have 5 separate ranks in competitive, okay? I want to be clear. You don't queue up for 5 different things, right? You actually are only going to have 1, right? You just queue up for a game, okay? And then now when you load in, you're still going to have a role lock system where you can only have 1 of each role, but you can play a variety of positions, right? So basically it's like when you do a custom game with role lock enabled, where once a role is filled, it stops other people from picking the characters in that role, right? I think with this, you would also be able to request swaps with your teammates so that you can, you know, be much more flexible during the match. But basically what this does is just that it's really a queue time thing. 5 different queues would be insanely hard to get correct with what's it called, balance for time sake, for queue times rather. So everyone, if you're going to have a solution like this, I think everyone should have to there needs to be some sort of way to change your role mid-match, and a little more flexibility there. Side note, if this came to the main game as well, I would not be opposed. And I feel like that's a good middle ground queue for solution for queue times. If they don't want to do this, where it's just one rank, I feel like and to be honest, I'm going to explain what all of these are, but like these would be your tank role, these would be your DPS role, these would be your support role, right? Actually, before I go into it, let me actually explain. I forgot what these are. So the tanks are going to be like, and it could be anything, right? Like if Blizzard were to split them up, it doesn't have to be like these arbitrary things I've come up with. It could be other things. But how I have it is that tanks would work like your main tanks would in Overwatch 1. Main creators of space have little more versatile kits. They kind of work in different ways, right? And, as I go through this, I just have a general idea of what I think they could be, but there could definitely be some differences, and you could change them. How is that different than an Enforcer? As you'll see, there's some tanks in the Enforcer role and then some DPS. Enforcers are kind of like your off tanks, right? I've put the off tanks in here just cuz, and I have a lot of other characters that kind of work. Basically, they help enforce the space that's already been taken. Think about like a Mei, Reaper, and Cassidy, right? They have like either good defensive pressure, or they're very sustainable, or they have like a super high damage output that dissuades people from coming back there, right? This way, there's going to be one Enforcer, and the way here is that we introduce some tank synergies back, and if the tanks in this category would definitely be shot down a little bit, right? They would have to be nerfed into a position. Basically, they're going to be a less effective version of their old self, right? So that they can still do the off-tank thing, but it's not going to be nearly as oppressive as it used to be before, right? So D.Va might have way less health, or Defense Matrix maybe not as much resource, stuff like that, right? So they play a different role, right? They don't play as a second tank. They play as more of a faux DPS, right? This other presence. And the DPS in here actually kind of play as faux off tanks. That way, it's not every game has two tanks, or they only have like the 1-2-2. There's a little bit of variety here. You can give up some direct synergy, like you don't have to have a D.Va or a Sigma and give up some of that direct synergy, and instead have a much more damaging version of it, right? Like there's a lot of more layers here, right? Then you would have your DPS, which are just focused on regular doing damage. They don't do much other utility or anything like that for the most part. They're just kind of more for traditional DPS kind of stuff. Then you'll have your protectors, which are the more main support type characters. I have Baptiste in there just cuz. And then the heroes, which are more your flex support, like the ones that are going to be making more plays, more DPS oriented, right? So you're like, honestly, these would probably be swapped, where like the heroes are more on the DPS side or whatever. But that's kind of like, it's basically what the old roles used to be. We only have 5 heroes, right? So I wanted that to be, said, because when we talk about this and we assume that we're going to have like this 5 roles, I know this is radical, I get it. But let's talk about, the 2 solutions you could have here. Here's the first solution I've came up with. Every character is in one role, right? So D.Va is not a tank, she is an Enforcer. You can only pick her in the Enforcer slot, right? If you pick D.Va, the rest of these characters are X'd out, no one else can play them, right? This, I think, would make the balance of individual characters a lot easier, because then you can't play them in other spots, right? Like, you would either have a D.Va or you would have one of those other characters, right? Because we'll talk about the second solution, which is actually like a mixture of like some characters can be either tanks or Enforcers, or some characters may be DPS or Enforcers, stuff like that. The reason why that is not a great solution, or like what is the advantage of having one per role, is that it makes what you're looking at more consistent. Because I do think you would have to change characters based on what roles that they're currently in. Like, solo tank D.Va and Enforcer D.Va, Enforcer D.Va cannot exist like she does right now, right? So if she were also a tank that you could pick, then she would have 2 different versions of D.Va, and I feel like that's a little confusing. And also, like one of the benefits of initially role lock is that it brought the total scope of combinations in a lot, so that there were less like really weird, wacky comps you could come up with, but I feel like that meant you could engage with the comps much more, right? Think about GOATs. I know it was in a pre-role lock era, but since GOATs was 6 characters that you knew were always going to be there with very little exceptions, you could really hone in on the metas and really learn like everything about like what every character does and get really skillful in that. When you limit the amount of choices that are possible, that naturally occurs more often. So right now, I feel like we had a step in the right direction with 5v5 the way that we have, where it's just kind of like more open and there's a lot more variety. I feel like this is a good middle ground of like the 5v5 stuff is still kind of here, but that more like condensed, honed in the reason why role lock was so good in the first place. I feel like that's the biggest benefit of role lock outside of just like queues and or like just like knowing you'll have a support is that you can engage with the comps a little better, more consistently because there's less factors, right? I feel like this is a good middle ground solution for that. And then also, I feel like this is a really big one, is that characters can be balanced around which role that they are in, right? Think about the metas that we've had for a really long time, right? Tracer, Sojourn, every single game, almost for a very long time, right? Lucio, Kiri, every single game, almost for a super long time. What if, in this system, look at this. Tracer and Sojourn are in the same category. That means you cannot have both of them on your team. That means some of these like really overbearing DPS pairs are not possible, right? And if, let's say Sojourn was an enforcer and people were like, I think Sojourn is too weak in this role, she could go over to the DPS role, right? Like there's a lot of like, you can do balance based off like the individual roles that they are, right? Like Baptiste, like, oh, you're kind of forced to only do double flex support when I feel like it's better if you have, one of these characters instead of a BAP in the protector slot. Well, then you could throw BAP into the hero slot, right? As like a better fit, better balance for the game, right? If there's combinations that are too good, you can swap characters into other roles, and then those combinations disappear without having to touch what makes the character super fun. It's just another knob, another dial for them to turn, right? The other way, and I have another sheet here, it's just that there's a little bit of overlap, right? So I'll show you a good example, right? So I have Sigma coming back to the tank category, but he's also an enforcer, right? So if you were to pick Sigma in the tank role, then, Diva or Sigma in the enforcer role would not be able to be picked, right? Same thing here. Like I have Venture in the enforcer role and the DPS role. If you picked Venture and then your other DPS picked, I don't know, Genji, then Venture would be the enforcer. But if your other DPS picked Symmetra, Venture would be the DPS, right? Because, those are character, or I guess Genji's in enforcers as well. Basically, like, it's a little confusing, and I feel like that's kind of like a bane of why I wouldn't go with this solution, but I wanted to make it in here, basically because it allows for more variety. It allows for all rounders to be in different roles because they can fit both of those roles. And it's also better for requesting swaps, because I feel like a lot of people don't want to be shoehorned in these really tiny character selections. So if there's some overlap, so like if somebody wants to swap with you, then you're going to go over to their role and your character or one of your characters is more likely to be in there. That would probably work better. I just wanted to bring this up because I feel like that could be a good like solution if they wanted to go that way. But I think this would be the better one in general. So, obviously we can talk about the problems. If Blizzard were to implement this, there's a high likelihood. Now, I don't think they would, but there's a high likelihood that they would make all 5 roles different. And you queue up for all 5 roles individually. Bad. Queue times would be really, really awful. Also trying to figure out like what's the middle ground between these old characters. I feel like a lot of characters I don't think they would have to get reworked per se, but I think a lot of their power would have to shift based on what role that they're in. And again, I talked about it earlier. Some people may not like the fact that they are stuck with only, 5 characters. What if Baptiste went here, right? 4 characters to pick from. So not a great solution overall. Like Sombra could be a hero, right? If you wanted to get rid of the what's it called? The healing pressure and just have like straight utility, that could be Sombra, right? She can move over there. But basically, like, trying to fill out the hero rosters. Again, we may not have enough heroes to do this overall, even though we are, we're at 40 right now. We're about to be over 40. We still might not have enough for it. And at the end of the day, this is a little confusing, and the traditional roles are going to go away, right? Like, tanks don't really exist in this format. I mean, they do by name, again, arbitrary name, but like the tank role as we know it is different, right? Diva would not be a tank, right? And that may be a hard sell for everybody. And again, it's like, it's hard to justify. It's like, well, Sim and Zarya are in the same category. Why is that, right? Roadhog and Torb are in the same category. Like, just such weird swaps sometimes. So it would take a lot of time to figure out who is going to be where. Again, this is just kind of like an initial idea I had, and I wanted to throw it by you guys. But I think this could be definitely a way to introduce counterplay to counter swapping. Because if somebody, let's say you're playing Wrecking Ball and they're like, I'm just going to go, bad example. Let me say I'm playing Winston and they're like, I'm just going to play Mauga. Then your Enforcer can go, you know what? I'll play Diva, right? I'll keep my Winston alive, right? And then now that tank, he can still play around what you guys have done because Diva would be a much weaker version. But there is some way to outplay the tank counter swapping, right? This is a solution to, we can't rework every character all the time. It takes years and years and years to do it. So let's not go all the way back to 6v6. Let's just try to have this middle ground solution. What did we like from 6v6? And I feel like there was like this higher like engagement with the game and counterplay and all of that. That is here. Also, with this system, if they're really gung-ho about role passives, it distributes them a lot better. So that Roadhog's not going to get like the knockback passive or anything like that. The Enforcers don't need the traditional tank passives, right? So we can get rid of some of these things, right? The characters that it doesn't matter nearly as much. You know what I mean? I have a whole video about tank or about role passives in general. I don't like them very much, but I feel like this is a good way to divvy them up a little more and not make them so overbearing, right? Like, because there are plenty of DPS that don't benefit from the DPS passive very much, but like some of them in here don't benefit very much. Cassidy, Mei, Reaper, Sim. They don't really benefit from it that much. They can have their own passive that benefits them more, right? Maybe the Enforcers have damage reduction. Maybe the tank, or like only Enforcers have damage reduction. Maybe tanks only have knockback reduction. Maybe the DPS, again, we can change a couple around, have the traditional DPS passive. Maybe only the Protectors have, what's it called? The support passive. Maybe the heroes have their own passive, right? It makes things a little more complicated, but it is more balanced ops, right? It's less variety within roles, which means you can balance for making a role do one holistic thing much better, right? Having 12 characters that have to do the exact same thing that are all differently designed, that's a bit hard. It's really hard. Having 8 characters that are supposed to do the same thing, that's much more manageable, right? Having 18 or however many DPS characters there are, that's a hard sell. But having only like, how many, I'm not going to count this, 12? That's better. That's way better. It's healthier, it's easier to do. And again, characters are going to be added over time, but once this system it could be in play, they could then keep designing the new heroes around like, okay, this one is going to be an Enforcer, right? So they kind of have an idea of what their playstyle should be. And again, it doesn't force like specific playstyles on people. It just kind of hones them in a little more. There's still nuance in how Overwatch plays. That's never going to go away. There's still decisions to make. It's just the reins are a little more in, right? There's not as much like variety. There's not as much just like, well, this character could do this thing and this character could, and all of that, like just everyone has a little more of a niche. They still have room to work and room to do other things, but they have a little bit more of a defined role. And that may help on ladder to be like, hey, you're the protector. This is what you're doing. This is what you should be focusing on, right? It may actually help the game feel better on a teamwork perspective in ranked. But yeah, that's kind of it. Again, this is a weird idea. It's very experimental. It's just kind of like I had this idea and I wanted to throw it out into the world because this could be on the way to a solution to the 5v5 problem, again, without eliminating 5v5. We want to get back to some of the things that we like about 6v6 without completely getting rid of 5v5, because it's probably not going to happen. So this is kind of my middle ground solution. Let me know what you think about it. Is it a trash idea? Is it a cool idea? I'd love to hear about it. You can put a comment down below. If you like this video, like, comment, subscribe, any of that good YouTube stuff. It does really help me out at the end of the day. If you want to get in on these discussions live, that is going to be twitch.tv/Lane Hemingway. I try to do a discussion every single time I go live, always something to talk to me about. If you want to send me a hot take or an Overwatch rework idea or any kind of suggestion for Overwatch, join my Discord. It's down in the description below with the rest of my socials. And thank you so much for watching. Have a good day.